Okay, welcome everybody. My name's Andrew Stuck. I'm a co-producer of Walk, Listen, Create. We're a not-for-profit. Our whole objective is to support artists, performers, and writers who make work on foot. And that's fairly niche, but we actually have over 1,600 contributors to the community already, and one of whom was someone called Anne de Forest. And Anne came up with this really lovely idea that she wanted to interview and talk with and have conversations with American walking writers who are writing about America. And we were only too happy to help. So this is an inaugural event, and I'm going to be really in the background and not involved at all. And I'm going to hand over to Anne. But before I do, I'm going to read her biography and introduce her to you. So just bear with me. So, Anne de Forest's writing, as well as her practice as a walking artist, often centers on the resonance of place. Her short stories, essays, and poetry have appeared in Cleaver Magazine, Found Poetry Review, The Journal, and Hotel America, and the Timber Creek Review. Anne has documented stories of displacement for Al Buston, Seeds of Culture, examine the bonds that develop between home healthcare providers and their patients in the book Healing on the Home Front, and has walked the entire perimeter of Philadelphia with 3 other artists, initiating an ongoing collaboration to open up new conversations about margins and edges, the power of slow creative practice, and art as collective witness. She's the editor of Ways of Walking. So Anne, welcome, over to you.
Thank you so much, Andrew, and thank you to everyone at Walk, Listen, Create. This is really exciting. I just want to say a little bit about how Andrew mentioned the walk around the perimeter of Philadelphia, which I did in 2016, and walking has led me to ever since to amazing places and experiences that I had never expected to be involved with, including discovering this entire international community of walking artists, including connecting with people like Tom, writers like Tom and Neil. I see some other wonderful people I've made connections with as a result of this. As a writer, after I did this walk, I realized that people were interested in talking about walking, and a lot of people walked, and a lot of people wrote about walking. And so I had the idea of putting together an anthology of essays about walking that's called Ways of Walking, that published by New Door Books, which is an independent press here in Philadelphia in 2022. So that experience just keeps expanding, and I think all of you who are interested in both walking and writing will know just how those two acts have affinities with one another, but also that they lead to amazing connections that never keeps on going, keeps on developing. So in this idea that I had for Andrew, one of the things I was aware of with Walk, Listen, Create was that they're very international, but their American presence was a little smaller compared to representing people who do work in the UK, which is enormous in terms of walking artists, Europe, even Asia, and especially and Latin America. So I wanted to get in touch, figure out who's doing this work in the United States. And that was when I proposed this idea of having a series of conversations with writers who write about walking, who are American based. I don't think the walks necessarily have to be in America, but we're starting with 2 very American walks, and picking authors who might have something to say to each other. Their books have something to say to each other, so that there would be a dialogue about what's the same and what is different. So today I have 2 wonderful authors, 2 amazing books. The first one I'll introduce is by Tom Zoellner, and it's called From Rim to River. Tom took a journey on foot across the state of Arizona, which was 800 miles, 46 days. I also want to say that Tom contributed an essay to Ways of Walking, and the way I first encountered Tom was that I wrote him a fan letter, which is something that I rarely do, but he wrote this great essay. He wrote this great piece in the LA Times about walking out of LAX, and I was just so, I grew up in Los Angeles, I was so taken with it that I had to write him a letter, and we had a little back and forth, and then when I was starting to prepare for Ways of Walking, I said, is there a way to make that a longer and maybe slightly more literary essay? I think you were walking in Arizona at the time we corresponded about that. And he said, sure. And he wrote a marvelous essay about walking out of airports and walking in airports. Tom Zoellner, a fifth-generation Arizonan, is the author of 8, or is it now 9, nonfiction books, including The Heartless Stone, Uranium, A Safe Way in Arizona, The National Road, and Island on Fire, which won the 2020 National Book Critics Circle Award and was a finalist for the Bancroft Prize. He is also an editor-at-large for the LA Review of Books and a professor at Chapman University and Dartmouth College. And he's going to begin by reading a passage from Rim to River, looking into the heart of Arizona.
All right. Well, thank you, Anne, for that wonderful introduction. I'm really looking forward to dialoguing with Neil, particularly with what he's going to say about the Bayonne Bridge. I had my own experience with that bridge for a really strange reason, which we can talk about when Neil goes. Also, I want to sort of give a shout out to Frank Lahr there in the audience. Hello, Frank. This is yet another sort of odd story. Many years ago, I got a bee in my bonnet and set out to walk the length of the Santa Fe Trail, which I just want to say no one does this. The Santa Fe Trail, as you may be aware, was a wagon road that led to from the Anglo settlements in Missouri in the 1830s through the 1860s to the then Republic of Mexico with its northern outpost at Santa Fe. There's very little of this trail left. What you're doing is walking along the sides of rather undistinguished U.S. highways through Kansas and southeastern Colorado, and northern New Mexico. It's not terribly rewarding from a hiking perspective. Like this really is a very silly, very eccentric thing to do. But I'm with my tribe here, so I know that you guys get where I'm coming from. You all, I think, in this room have done these crazy walks in places that are not friendly to pedestrians. So Frank reached out to me just a couple days ago and said, hey, I don't know if you're aware of this, but we actually crossed paths in the town of Lamar, Colorado in the summer of 1993. Frank, if I may, Frank, tell this story. Yeah, okay. Frank was walking from where he was then living in Snowmass, Colorado, all the way to the East Coast, an even longer and pretty crazier journey than mine. And both of us had this habit of making conversation with folks in these towns, which is, I think, what we do as walkers, right? I mean, that's half the pleasure of walking is, you know, having spontaneous encounters along the way. The editor of the newspaper in Lamar picks up on the fact that, hey, here's these two weirdos coming through the town from different directions and from different reasons. I was on this kind of quasi historical journey, almost a secular kind of a religious quest, and Frank was doing it for his own reasons, and we crossed but didn't meet. And so the newspaper, I guess they must have had a dedicated beat that summer of, you know, crazy people walking through town. So anyway, Frank unearthed this newspaper story that existed long before the not shortly before the World Wide Web, 1993. and sends me this very nice note on Facebook. And this is the very first time that I think I'm looking at him. Unless, Frank, we must have walked past each other, right?
Must have, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there was no other way to do it, because I was on a trajectory heading southwest, and you were on a trajectory headed straight west, or zigzaggy west.
East. I was going east.
You were going east. Sorry, east. You're right. So obviously it's possible to walk in someone's path without seeing them, but we cross paths. So anyway, Frank, all this is a long way of saying it's really good to see you. And this is also maybe exhibit A in the lessons of serendipity when it comes to walking. And the way, perhaps the law of recurrence, the way that things have a way of coming back. So I think about that insane walk that I made from Kansas, what amounts to Kansas City, Missouri to Santa Fe, New Mexico, all the way border to border across the state of Kansas. And that experience would kind of fuel a later journey, border to border, lengthwise, the longest way across my home state of Arizona. Which you see there's resulted in a book from the University of Arizona Press. And it's less a book about the walk itself. That's a framing device for essays about my state, which is an immature state in the Union. Andrew, I think you've spent time in Arizona. You know what I'm talking about. It's a place in formation. It's a place that hasn't really discovered what it is. And there's some unhappiness in this journey, but it's also a glorious place. And so I wanted to say the critical things about Arizona that should be said, but also, in a sense, write a love letter to it. And therefore, a walk across it is a way to try to lasso in all the magnificence and all of the things that are should be put under the critical microscope. Some of you readers of Western American literature may be familiar with Wallace Stegner's wonderful book, Mormon Country, about Utah and the Intermountain West. This was I tried to do for Arizona what Stegner did in that book, or Larry McMurtry's collection of essays about Texas called In a Narrow Grave. I think the Arizona literary canon needs a lot of building out. There's no better way to create a narrative for a place than simply to write about it. And that's what we do as walkers. We create narratives as we walk. The walking itself is a narrative. And so I try and keep readings short. I'm going to keep this one relatively brief. I'm going to read about something that happened that didn't really create any wow moments. It was a quieter thing than that. What's on the screen here that Andrew's put up, I see successfully, good, is the Arizona Trail follows an amalgam of established walking trails through federal land, county land, state land, and also private property. That easements had to be painstakingly acquired. The Arizona Trail is a bit like the Appalachian Trail in that regard. Or the Florida Trail. Some of you may be familiar with that. The Colorado Trail. These kinds of long distance walks that attempt to define a particular geography. So on the left, that's through a gigantic cattle ranch, what used to be the largest contiguous spread of livestock property in Arizona. It's called the Babbitt Ranch. It's in northern Arizona near Flagstaff, and the peak you see in the background is what's called Humphreys Peak, named for a military figure of the 19th century. The Diné people, otherwise known as Navajo, of northern Arizona, referred to it as Dukslid, which in their language translates to English as abalone shell woman, a important creature in their cosmology. And the abalone shell, you might be wondering, well, what are abalone shells doing in the middle of a semi-arid pine-covered plateau? You'd be asking a very good question. Abalone shells were harvested off the California coast and used as commerce in a radius of thousands of miles, including among the Diné. And so they were currency. This would be like naming one of your figures, like, $5 bill woman. And I don't mean to demean this in any way. This is merely, I think, a vivid symbol for the interconnectedness of indigenous peoples prior to European contact. That there were trade routes that linked the Chumash people of what we call California today with the Tohono O'odham of southern Arizona and the Diné people of northern Arizona. How did they get there? How did they make contact with each other? I ask you. Well, suffice to say, they were not getting in their Mercedes Sprinter vans and driving these currencies in exchange for pelts. They were walking. They were doing exactly what we do here today, what we celebrate today. On the right, that's a fairly representative look at what the Arizona Trail looks like in northern Arizona. Just as you see, a single file path through kind of a undulating plateau-like landscape. All right, I'm going to read briefly. This is far further south on the trail. This is in a set of mountains, and I think it's pretty self-explanatory. Here we go. In front of me is Hardscrabble Mesa to the west and the beginning of the Matzatzal Mountains, the hardest stretch of the trip. They are barely 100 miles from metropolitan Phoenix, and yet one of the least known and visited ranges in the entire state. The name is from the Nahuatl indigenous language of Mexico and means place of the deer. And the local pronunciation is mad as hell. Historian Thomas Sheridan wrote this passage about these mountains that has always haunted me. He wrote, if you hike into the Matzatzals, you pass jagged outcrops of rocks that are 2 billion years old. These rocks were Arizona before Arizona had a name, and they will be Arizona long. All of us, Paleolithic mammoth hunters, Hohokam farmers, Mexican ranchers, Anglo-American dam builders, and city dwellers are light dust on these rocks. The land should make us humble, but it rarely does. The trail winds through meadows, over a ridge, down the service road for a humming power line, then up and over a vicious malpais littered with sharp volcanic rocks. I fill up bottles at White Rock Spring, go past the LF Ranch with its bunkhouse, then up and over the northern edge through the steep drainage of Bullfrog Canyon, littered with yellow wildflowers. Sweat tumbles out from me relentlessly and helplessly, and I stop to chug down an entire liter of water. This walk has forever changed my relationship with water. I now understand it as a substance like gasoline or motor oil, and I am acutely conscious of how close I am to death should I ever run out. Locations of active springs are loaded onto a crowdsourced phone app made by a Flagstaff company called Guthook, which has saved me time after time. Because not every spring listed on the paper map still flows. In fact, many have long dried up. Why does this happen? What governs the underground motions of water as it flows through the veins of the ground beneath us? Springs emerge when subterranean water gets pushed up via a crack in the caprock, sometimes at the pace of a slow seep and other times with the force of a stream. This can take centuries to achieve. They can dry up in times of drought, or when nearby users lower the groundwater through overpumping, even though the ventricles remain. The Lord giveth, the Lord taketh away. As the shadows descend and the burning sky begins to cool, the limestone cairns on the faint trail begin to look like scattered bones, and I spot a hole that looks like a lunar crater. Up on a ridge, I can perceive the lemony glow of metropolitan Phoenix to the southwest. Perhaps it was the exertion of the day, or perhaps it is feeling reasonably secure with water for the first time in a while, but I experience a moment of peace, almost to the point of intoxication, that I hadn't felt for some time. All of what surrounds me, the stars, the moon, the weeds, the bugs, the mountains, the shine of the unseen city, felt connected in a giant design whose scaffolding laid all around, but could not be physically perceived. The separation of all the world's parts, what the classic Chinese text Tao Te Ching calls the 10,000 things, can seem like the greatest of delusions in certain moments of ecstasy. And then just as quickly you're out of it. The feeling of unification does not last. I reluctantly leave this ridge whose name I do not know to look for a campsite in the lower valley, my flashlight prodding in the dark. The morning takes me up near the crest of the Mazatzals, a series of stone heads that looks like a line of Cenozoic spark plugs. The trail is littered with broken chips of slate, and bees buzz in the yuccas with dismayed stems like they are surrendering themselves to the heat. There is nothing to be seen of humanity's mark except the trail itself, which winds in unpredictable directions. I lose sense of compass points, and at length, I come to another ridgetop, and it all clicks back into place. With that, I'll stop, and I think at this point, I'm going to hand the baton over to Neil.
Hi, thank you, Tom. That was beautiful. And thanks for giving us the context of your talk, and it made me think of things that we could talk about in conversation as well as we go on. But now I want to introduce you all to Neil King, Jr., who also did an epic walk, not quite as long and not quite as far, although it went through more states. He walked out of his house in Washington, D.C., and ended up at the Rambles in Central Park in New York City. It took 26 days and 330 miles. I had the pleasure of meeting and talking with Neil back in the spring when he was on book tour for this book. And I can imagine what it would be like to meet Neil on the road. He's somebody that makes friends with everybody he encounters, and it's pretty wonderful. He's a former national security reporter and editor for the Wall Street Journal. He was deeply involved in the coverage of 9/11 that won the Journal the Pulitzer Prize. Since then, he has written for the New York Times, the Atlantic, the Wall Street Journal, and many others. American Ramble is his first book. He lives in New York City and Washington, D.C. And welcome, Neil. And his passage comes near the end of his walk when he's arriving in New York City, but you can set it up.
Yeah, in the context department, by the way, thank you so much for having me, Anne, and I'm enjoying being with you, Tom, and everyone else who's here. I really appreciate it. I think it might help to do a little bit of a preamble to the walk itself. My walk was very, I guess what distinguishes it, for one, it was very intentionally, and I think critically, a walk out my front door at a very kind of perilous, strained time in American history. I had originally planned to walk out the door at the end of March of 2020. COVID obviously closed the world down. I gave it another year. We had an uproarious, tumultuous, actually quite horrific year. George Floyd death, the mass protests, all the various things that happened, which made the context into which I stepped a profoundly different one than if I had gone out the door at the end of March of 2020. And, my intention was to take not a trail. I'm not anti-trail, but I was not interested in trails. I wanted to walk through the landscape, the human landscape, up the roads, up the railroad tracks, that whole thing. And I wanted to pay attention. My book, I think one of the things that makes it a little bit odd, and it was a kind of a high wire act of sorts in the doing of it, is I write about every day. I walk for 26 days, and it's very much of a kind of day by day meditation on time and our history and what we're here to do and think about, but with a particular approach and attention to the land and what it does to the spirit or the mind to put aside the things that absorb us and distract us and and just be about each step. And I never listened to a scrap of music, the one podcast, not one thing. It was just walk, meditate, listen, think. So when you do that, it turns out, I assume others on this screen could probably testify to the same thing. You have revelatory, even rapturous experiences that are perhaps elusive to people who don't do this kind of thing. And this one passage I'm going to read kind of gets to that a little bit. And it was near the end of the walk. I'd gone all the way up. I was nearing New York City, having to navigate myself back into this sort of urban environment. And of all the odd places where one would have a kind of rapture, crossing from Staten Island over the Kilbon Cool into Jersey City, on the way to Jersey City over the Bayonne Bridge is not the normal place for this kind of thing. So I'll read this one passage, which basically starts with me accounting for the days and weeks beforehand and my sort of state of mind. As I went day after day, opening myself to the people and places I encountered, I became in turn more open to those places and people, more in tune, more in sync, as Ted had predicted in his driveway on that third morning of the walk. Absent the other world distractions buried in our iPhones or laptops, I could feel my capacity for awe and wonder grow exponentially with the days. All I came to care about was what I saw around me, the people I met, the little shifts in culture or barn design, the texture of the land I crossed, the nuances of the forests or the farms. I tried to care about that with all the energies usually spent on caring about more distant and abstract things. It was, I suppose, an effort to grant preeminence to place, to make the present truly immediate, to have it stripped as much as possible of all unnecessary mediation, to have attention, as the good poet said, be the beginning of devotion. Perhaps that explains why, when I stepped out onto the initial incline going up the huge sweep of the Bayonne Bridge, the sight of the Manhattan skyline hit me with a physical force. I hadn't been looking for the city. I had my eyes at my feet. I was thinking of other things. Then I raised my head while walking the up-ramp, the wind coming strong and bracing from the north, and the sudden sight of the city's jagged towers and the sparkle of the river above the Richmond rooftops washed over me like an ocean wave. I cupped my head in my hands so it might have looked like sobs, but was instead a weird form of laughter. A bike rider who zipped past might have thought I was distraught and planning to jump. I just sat in the sunlight by a concrete barrier, buffered by the wind, and looked at the city, overcome. The Quakers might have said that I quaked, the Shakers that I shook. I heaved with the bodily joy. My delight sprang in part from the satisfaction of nearing the end of a long pilgrimage. It may have been tinged even by some fleck of regret that it was nearly over. I had seen for the first time, laid out against the morning sky, an outline of the place I'd been walking toward for 25 days, a skyline altered utterly by human hands, with sheets of glass jutting to impossible heights from a sliver of metamorphic schist tucked between two rivers. But this weird rapture went beyond mere gratification. I had seen this skyline before. 1,000 times over the years, I had caught sight of it from all directions as a cab driver and a common traveler. But on this morning, the sight of it physically astonished and stunned me. The days and all those steps had pried open a part of the human spirit that magnifies the potency of otherwise simple things and grants the commonplace a touch of the divine. F. Scott Fitzgerald wrote in The Great Gatsby that New York, as seen from the Queensboro Bridge, is always the city as seen for the first time in its wild first promise of all the mystery and the beauty of the world. That first time effect of seeing things with a renewed vividness and punch isn't simply a refreshing power, the bridge gives. It's a power Fitzgerald himself had nurtured, and a power any of us can grant ourselves. It comes, I think, from the cleansing of the eyes, but also a stripping away of the extraneous things that weigh us down. The eye is the lamp of the body, says Matthew's gospel. If your eye is clear, your whole body will be full of light. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. That was wonderful. That was I'm just picturing the whole scene as walking over the bridge. And I was wondering, I had a question to start with, but since Tom wanted to talk to you about the Bayonne Bridge, I think that's actually a very good segue to get you two talking to each other, for Tom to ask you that question or talk to you about that experience, and then we'll move on to talking a little bit more about your bigger projects in a bigger way. And I have questions about your how the two books relate to one another as well.
Sure. I mean, just to set the scene, the Bayonne Bridge is it's a graceful crescent that connects Staten Island, one of the lower parts of Staten Island, with Bayonne, New Jersey, which is a famously tough blue collar town, port city. If you're familiar with the 1976 movie Rocky, as I know you are, Anne, as a Philadelphian, Rocky was a spec screenplay written by struggling actor Sylvester Stallone after he watched on a kind of a pay-per-view movie theater thing, a staged fight in between Muhammad Ali and a guy named Chuck Wepner, an amateur boxer that no one had heard of, who was called the Bayonne Bleeder from Bayonne, New Jersey, local tough guy. And he shocked everyone by actually not getting knocked out by Muhammad Ali. He kept getting up and kept, getting knocked down, kept getting up. And he lasted 15 rounds, which was considered something of a real comeback story in sports, and lost a split decision. Anyway, it inspired the movie Rocky, and that's one of Bayonne's claims to fame. The reason why I was attracted to the Bayonne Bridge, which does not inspire anyone really to write poetry, except for
Neil,
except for me and Neil, it's got Neil may know this. It's got a kind of a strange place in atomic history. Radium material from an African mine called Shinkolobwe and in what is now DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo, was evacuated from there by a Belgian mining company shortly after the Nazis invaded Belgium, because there had been some early scientific reports that there could be something extremely useful about uranium. Weren't quite sure what, but there was a potential for the chain reaction to be used in a bomb. And so the head of what was called Union Minerais, the Belgian corporation that owned that mine, arranged for all this uranium to be shipped out of Belgian Congo and taken to a vegetable oil warehouse on Staten Island that happened to be almost right under the Bayonne Bridge. That material later became most of what exploded over Hiroshima. So what Neil was walking over, and what I later paid my own pilgrimage to, the material that destroyed Hiroshima just pretty much sat there on industrial ground near the southern footing of it.
Oh, that's interesting. Neil, did you know about that when you crossed it? I think you're muted.
No, I was not aware of that. No.
Yeah.
There was an infinitude of things to be aware of. And, part of the complexity of these kinds of walks is, of course, what you focus on and what you choose to ignore. And, whether you take a right or a left determines, the nature of any walk. And So I paid attention to the things that were there to be paid attention to and had to ignore the rest because the
Yeah.
story goes on forever and you can just be engulfed by them if you. And mine was very much of a keep moving, don't try to kind of get bogged down into the certain things. I wanted it to have a kind of a fleet-footedness about it and the things that it explored. So
Yeah, it's really interesting. It's really interesting to hear you both talk, having read both your books and thinking about what the differences are between them and the way that they're structured. Because I had this thought of Neil's book is the feeling of your book to me, Neil, is that you're walking with someone. That you're accompanying someone on a walk, and it's very direct. You walk out your front door, and we're following you the whole way. And Tom, as he was saying about his structure, was there are these essays that are sort of attached to the walk, and the walk is the spine. And the sense I got, there's this wonderful sort of free associative quality that it's very crafted, but you get to a point and then you say, oh, that kind of reminds me of X. And then we have this wonderful essay that goes into some aspect of Arizona history or culture. And it's almost like at the end of the day, after you've had your walk, I could imagine, you meet up with people in a diner and then you're telling these tales that are actually with history and well researched. So I think I like having you both here as giving a sense of the flavor of the walks. I can see how it comes out of your two different approaches. I guess my first question is sort of why a walk? What made a walk the way that you wanted to experience these landscapes? And I know with Neil, and Neil can talk a little bit more about, there was a part of America, as you said, it was a very difficult time. We just went through 2020, searching for points of political division. What made you think the walk was the way to come to terms with that, or come to terms with the weird history of what Arizona is?
oh, I'm sorry, just going to Tom or okay.
No,
Sorry.
no, to you, either of you. Go ahead, Neil, go first. You can go first.
I mean, I'm not anti, walking the Pacific Crest Trail or the Appalachian Trail or stuff like that. My walk was I was never wanted to impress anybody by any amount of mileage or any supposed challenge of the walk itself. This was a walk out my door with a heightened degree of attentiveness after having spent more than a year focused on what I might find in between, reading the history, studying the ancient maps, all of that. And then it was really kind of a devotional act. And as any of us know that are walkers, the difference between walking a landscape and driving it are incomparable. You are literally not in the same place. And I think that's driven home even more when you're intersecting with cars and the like, and you're so much more aware of the profound difference in space that you both theoretically occupy but don't occupy. So mine was an immersion exercise. It was more, what if I go out and just try to derive and sort of absorb as much meaning as I can from that 330-mile stretch that goes right through kind of the heart of the American story, the heart of sort of our origin, where the documents were written, where the original battles were fought, where the slaves had to flee for freedom, the whole of that, and just thought about it, and then kind of tried to capture that process of digesting it. So the walk, of course, as any of us can testify who do that, was absolutely essential for the slowness of it and the deliberateness. And it's funny because I just recently reread Steinbeck's Travels with Charlie, and I'm not going to trash, a Pulitzer Prize or a Nobel Prize winning famous writer, but sorry, that book has some profound deficiencies in it. And he covers like hundreds of miles where nothing happens, where he's meeting people like tangentially. There's like actually weirdly little immersion and almost no spiritual uplift in that book. And to me, it's a early 1960s testimony of what a road book doesn't really give that a walking book can give if you go about it the right way.
That's an interesting thing you say. Tom has written a road book as well, so I'm curious about what the difference between walking and doing a road book are. Walking, doing a classic American automobile road trip versus the walking.
Right. Both of them face a sort of a fundamental narrative problem, which is that I think the patience of both the writer and the reader can only go so far with paragraph after paragraph of, the wheels turned, or I put my legs forward and here's what I saw. And then, around another bend, here's what I saw. There has to be something more to it. There must be some sort of object of desire, so to speak, or a kind of a quest or a narrative propulsion
Mhm.
that gives it more of a structure and more of a plot to it. These are, I think, anyone writing a hiking memoir has to contend with that problem.
Yeah. I know I found that in my own writing is that when writing about the perimeter walk, that I have a hard time writing about it because it ends up becoming pure narrative, and it's sort of with more of the distance I get from it, the more I can write about it. But because it was a walk that we took just to walk and see the city, it's sort of then you have to do you have to figure out what the point of it is afterwards. But almost the point was to be the process and the process of walking, which is very interesting, fascinating to do, but doesn't always make for fascinating reading. So you have to figure out what the structure is going to be. One of the things I was impressed in both your books is how you weave history in. Neil, I'm curious about research, and I know a little bit about Neil's approach, having talked to him before, but how do you decide how much to research in advance versus what to research afterwards? And how does what you know inform your walk or shape maybe what you're looking for?
Yeah. It wasn't really my motto upon departure, but it was very much what struck me again and again as I went, and I write about this in the book. But if you bring meaning with you, which is to say you bring prior knowledge and a depth of understanding about, the ancientness of the Susquehanna River and why it is the way it is, which is the, I think, 5th oldest river in the world that goes back to, continents long gone. The meaning repay that the places repay you with their own meaning. It is literally a transaction. I mean, not that sounds kind of gross, but it's a back and forth, a washing back and forth. So I did, huge amounts of reading. I had read, I don't know, dozens and dozens, if not into the hundreds of travel, early, not 19th century writings of de Tocqueville and Dickens, but all kinds of people that most of us have never heard of, the British who came over, all the people that were so curious about, would this country last? What was it about? So there's a lot of immersion and a lot of things like that, most of which never went even nearly close to the book. It was just my own fodder. And then, part of the walk was not just serendipitous encounters. I had arranged to meet with historians and various people along the way where I wanted to be able to bring alive certain moments, and those fell together just with miraculous, I don't know, they worked, all of them worked, and I needed them to work. I wasn't there to stay for 3 more days to have it work. I had to have it work that afternoon. And so it was a kind of a mixture of that. And I wanted very much the history to be fast. I never wanted to, if I was going to tell the story of the Mason-Dixon line, I was like, okay, I'm going to devote 2 or 3 days to digesting everything I can about Mason, Dixon, the line, why did they draw it, etc. But I'm going to then boil it down to 7 paragraphs. I did not want it to be a sort of didactic, okay, please, I don't want to know any more about this. It's like a walk, you keep moving, and I wanted to keep it swift. So there's a lot of historical explorations and nuggets, but I was very determined to keep them fast, basically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What about you, Tom? In terms of research, did you do a lot of research in advance of the walk, or did the research part come after you were walking?
A combination thereof, and this is also like the problem faced with the hiking narrative about how long can I really describe, the experience of walking from place to place, and is this going to tucker out the reader? In the same way, a single footstep could contain an encyclopedia
Yeah.
in terms of the geology, the political history, the economic history, whatever it may be, of the ground that you happen to be covering on. And so you have to do a necessary, I think, as Neil said earlier, a necessary attenuation of everything that you could say. We got into it a little bit with the Bayonne Bridge. I mean, the fact that nuclear material was stored underneath it is just a sliver of all the things that we could say about that particular crescent. And there's no marker there to the uranium. I mean, that's something that actually, came out only in sort of really obscure research. And just as a sidelight, this was for a prior book, came out years ago, called Uranium. I called the guy who now owns a junkyard where that, the warehouse is long gone. As I said, there's no historic marker, no reason anyone would ever know this. And so I called this guy who's shall we say, a very Joycey kind of guy, the kind of guy who on the phone sounds like you didn't want to cross him. And I babbled something about, hey, I'm writing a book about, uranium. And hey, did you know that, that junkyard of yours, that there used to be this kind of blah, blah, blah. And he goes like, yeah, okay. So what do you want? And I said, I don't know. Did you ever hear about this? No, never heard of it. Okay. Is that all? Okay,
And
bye.
that was it. That was the
That was
end of
it.
the conversation.
Yeah, I mean, this is like the old, journalist sort of habit of calling someone for comment. And so it was, a weird call for comment because, this guy doesn't know this business about what's under the Bayonne Bridge. Anyway, all this is to say there's only, so no book was going to say absolutely everything, and no encyclopedia is going to say absolutely everything. So it does have to be a kind of a exercise in minimalism almost.
Well, and picking and choosing and creating a portrait of the place, which I think both of you do really wonderfully. One of the reasons I was excited about putting these two books together is that, so most of Neil's walk, even though he goes through several states, it takes place in the state I now live in, which is Pennsylvania. And Arizona and Pennsylvania are, I think, to many of us linked because of the 2020 election and watching the maps and waiting to see what color those states were going to turn. And I was thinking about how these two states are what we could call purple states or swing states. They have different names. And I know that's it's something that they share, although I think for very different reasons. But I was curious about what you saw about that political division. I know both of you talk about, what is the source of it historically, and what is the sense of the political divide in America by walking through these states today. What kinds of things did you discover?
Do you want me to talk first?
Sure.
It's interesting because the reality of American landscape is that if you go out any long walk, you're going to be walking for the vast majority of it through what would appear red on a map. I mean, the vast majority of the country as a landmass is conservative Republican country. And most of the counties I walked through were counties that Trump had taken. And Pennsylvania is a blue state because of Philadelphia and its surrounding suburbs, and Pittsburgh, and very tight knit places. And the same is true for Arizona. The vast majority, of course, is mainly empty state, but where it's still the dense places are where mainly the more liberal people are, and that's sort of the tension of the whole thing. But what was fascinating to me, though, and this is not the case in Arizona, where the settlement patterns were profoundly different, and you don't have clusters of, Quakers or Germans or, Mennonites or whatever, is the very microscopic, kind of nuanced micro nations, as I was kind of describing them, that you walk through, which are very profoundly different. And, I kind of half jestingly give them names and so on, but, I walk through 5 or 6 very, very distinctly different places in the state of Pennsylvania. And that observation is just an interesting one to make. And yes, they have their own political proclivities and so on, some of which go back, hundreds of years. I mean, there's a fingerprint on the landscape, which is particularly the case this side of the Mississippi. It gets different once you get more out west. It's more transient, but where the original settlers and what their predilections were, which is why New England is still a blue area, is because of literally the values and the thought patterns, et cetera, that the people have brought with them when they first arrived there. And that they have then kind of given that almost like a DNA to the people who have come after. But the one observation I'll make just generally that's sort of political is, we are now in a moment of great, global peril with all kinds of things happening that are highly distressing, domestically and internationally. And yet the thing that I always wrestle with, which the walk itself really drove home, is which is the reality, the walk that you go through when you immerse yourself in just the place you are, where you can be surrounded by extraordinarily generous people who you meet, and I mean, of course, I could have been shot if I'd gone down some other street. I could have had any number of other experiences, but is that, sort of the baseline of the world we live in, or is it this other thing that kind of causes anxiety, causes us to be concerned because of Gaza or Israel or Donald Trump planning this or whatever? And that kind of tension of the back and forth of what we find solace in versus what stirs anxiety, I think is a really fundamental aspect of just any of our lives. And the walk itself, which I'm sure others that are here can testify, just really fully brings out this other place that I constantly kind of go back to in my mind. And I know that it's a kind of a counter to the thing that most people are preoccupied by, which is a kind of an abstract degree of things that trouble them.
So that's saying that the encounter with the reality helps mitigate the kind of fear. If you don't go anywhere, you fear the things that you haven't experienced. Is that part of what you're talking about?
I mean, when I finally got to I-95 and you go to a rest stop in I-95, you're encountering people whose entire lives are cars at 60 miles an hour, their home, their television, their radio, maybe a newspaper, and some of their friends. And, yes, that is a world that's filled with a reality, but in terms of what's informing it, what's giving it substance, and that's, I think, one of the reasons that people can be so kind of highly anxious, and the polarization that people are talking about, it's being driven by forces that themselves aren't exactly natural, right? And part of the, when you go out and you walk and you meet a particular person in front of their house, in front of their barn, and you talk to them, they might have whatever politics, which might be interesting or not, but they've got a cool tractor in their yard and you're going to talk about that. That is the reality of a life we used to live more naturally in, that a lot of us are retreating from. And that, I think, is part of the source of a lot of toxicity that's out there now.
Yeah, oh, that's interesting. Tom, do you have anything to say to that, or also talk about that, how that plays out in Arizona?
Sure. You can't really write about Arizona without writing about its fractious politics, and in particular the descent of its Republican Party into its current state, which mirrors what's happening in the rest of the country. I would argue prefigures it even. But certainly it's easy to take shots at it or to write about it from a high and mighty perspective, but I didn't think that was going to be useful. So I wanted to write about what I call the kind of the rural political consensus of Arizona, and how that affects who we send to Congress in 5 out of our 9 seats, as well as what happens in legislature, and so that involved writing a history of the Republican Party in essay form. From roughly 1945 until 2022, and how we got from the Sun Belt capitalistic, almost department store kind of Barry Goldwater version of the Republican Party to today's version. The two forms of that type of libertarian tinged conservatism were alike in some ways and different than others. Their primary difference is more stylistic rather than ideological, but at any rate, I wanted to write about it from a thoughtful point of view and nothing, patronizing. I wanted to take them seriously.
Yeah, that was really interesting and well done. I think the surprise to me of learning about Arizona was that, I mean, it's an obvious thing, but I hadn't ever thought about it before, that the state was so new and that new people kept coming in all the time. So there wasn't a rootedness. I mean, the people who started to have a say in how the state was going to be shaped were not from there. They didn't have an attachment to the place or the land. So that was, I hadn't really thought about that before, about that's true in a lot of other places in the West, but I hadn't Arizona is really a 20th century invention.
Yes, the primary shifts come less through persuasion or party flipping and more through migration. So the old saying used to be refrigeration brings Republicans. The state had been controlled by a Democratic Party machine up until roughly the 1950s, when that began to change because of all this influx of primarily Anglo professional families from the Midwest who brought, and California too, who brought a Republican Party affiliation, as well as a generally kind of optimistic anti-government point of view, not the kind of pessimism that we see today. Now the reverse is true, that in migration it tends to be, of course, from international places, as well as for internal migration from within the United States, primarily from California and Colorado. And these folks are mainly Democrats. This is why Arizona is now a swing state.
From who's coming from where? That's interesting.
Who's coming from where, exactly.
Well, what did your walk, your two walks, both of your walks, leave you more hopeful or more pessimistic about the state of our country?
In both cases, far more optimistic.
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry, Neil. And not just Neil, but I think probably everyone in the room will testify to spontaneous encounters on the road from someone that you think you have nothing at all to do with, that turned out to be, my gosh, I'd like to live next door to you. This is such a great, reminder of the general goodness of human beings.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's great.
I don't know. Well, I've done all kinds of different things, like I'm sure most people here, over my life, where you go out into allegedly perilous places, and vast majorities of people think you're a fool to be doing it. And, all kinds of people thought I was a fool to be making this walk along these highways, because certainly these things would happen. And, my finding across, of all my decades is been almost without fail exactly the opposite, and in a lot of really bizarre places where I probably shouldn't have been walking or traveling, that were actually dangerous. But it does, that horrible things can happen. There are bad people out there. Yes, you can get kidnapped or murdered along the highway, but the kind of general goodness that you overwhelmingly encounter definitely leaves a mark. I was always a little reluctant. At the end of my book, I actually overtly say I'm not going to make sweeping judgments about the state of America based on my 26-day walk. And, I've found these things, and it's not science, right? I can't extrapolate from the people I met, therefore the state of the citizenry is like this or that. But but on the other hand, it left me very strongly with a sense of kind of a goodness being the primary thread, which I really believe generally. And you know, that extraordinary things can happen to an individual if you go out for a walk, you know, with the right frame of mind. And that's a pretty great thing that many of us are aware of, and a lot of people aren't.
That's wonderful. Yeah, I think that I feel like there's part of that is the spirit of walking, that you go into it. You're already open to those kinds of encounters when you set out for a walk. And maybe you have to be an optimist to be a walker. I don't know, but you're not, if you go out walking looking for bad things, you'll probably find them. But if you go out with this curiosity and openness, and both of you are journalists, I think you've cultivated that in your writing habits as well, that you find people interesting. And
Yeah, one of I talk a lot about in the book, and was I thought a lot about during the walk, is the whole subject of belonging. And I really, you know, in the US, there's a lot everywhere. There's a lot of conversations about privilege and what constitutes privilege. And it really came home to me strongly that the ultimate privilege that any of us can feel is also a privilege we can grant to others, which is the privilege of feeling that you belong, which is the opposite, which is the other side of welcoming someone. And that interchange between welcoming and therefore feeling that you belong because you were welcomed is the interaction between strangers. And you know, if you read you know, McFarland or all the other various stuff, Rory Stewart, or the things that are out there, people have done these huge walks through, particularly Rory Stewart, through very dangerous places. I mean, you know, Afghanistan and the Pashtuns, I mean, that's not exactly thought to be the most welcoming place in the world, but they have deeply embedded in their culture this concept of a deep hospitality, which I would argue that America has by and large lost the thread of. And, you know, there's the guy, oh shit, what's his name? The National Geographic guy whose name I'm now spacing out, who's walking, you know, doing this walk all the way to Tierra del Fuego, basically a walk around the world, essentially. And, you know, he went across the country of Georgia. I think it took him 50 to Paul Salopek. Great, thank you. I actually communicated with Paul. He's doing an extraordinary project. And he walked across the entire country of Georgia. I think it took him 50 nights. Every night, he was spontaneously put up by people, and probably every meal he was fed by people, you know, pulling canned things out of their cellar. And, you know, those discrepancies in cultures are just vast. And that is, you can find that in America, but it's not, I mean, we have literally created an industry that's called the hospitality industry, and that's where all that has gone to. And I had a few experiences along the way that kind of drove that home.
interesting. I wanted to, I want you to have a chance to ask a question to each other, if you have any questions for each other. And I do also want to open up to all of you who've been listening so closely and patiently, and see if you have questions as well and want to contribute to this conversation. So first of all, Tom or Neil, do you have something you would like to ask the other?
Yeah, sure. And I'm really super interested in hearing the other folks on this call, because I know there's some really thoughtful people on this call. I guess you know, it's funny, this is a question a lot of people asked of me, and I had a pretty ready answer, but putting aside the more journalistic side of your walk, which you obviously wove into the essays and stuff like that, but in terms of the walk itself, like how altered did you, outside of the difference in your muscular structure or whatever, did you feel because of the walk? Like how much did it change you?
That's a great question. Leaving aside the physical stuff, I'll say that what emerged was what I call in the book a mountain consciousness, meaning that I'm talking here about Arizona, that it's easy to live in some of its major cities while remaining unaware that you know, 70 miles away inside of a valley that you've never been to, a cactus wren is now making its nest. That all of these phenomena are happening everywhere all the time simultaneously, and that when you happen to be tucked away in solitude, as you often are on the Arizona Trail, you're seeing a side of the state that flourishes it goes through convulsions that you're completely unaware of when you're somewhere else, and that bills get passed in the Capitol and governors change, and the cactus wrens just keep on singing.
Yeah.
Can I flip that question back on you?
The same question back at me.
Yeah.
I mean, as was clear, I suppose, to some by the Bayonne Bridge sort of rapture thing I read. I mean, I had a number of really kind of, it's not like, illumination on the road to Damascus necessarily, but quite extraordinary, I don't know, kind of quasi-religious moments along the way that came out of nowhere. And I write a fair bit about that, how your spirit can be kind of wedged open in really novel ways because of the level of attentiveness. And they, came out of nowhere. But so there were, I mean, I felt like quite a changed person at the end. And it's, I've done a lot of things since then and before then, and it's kind of additive, but, and I know tons of people who have done Santiago de Compostela and all these various kinds of things who have also come away with this particular kind of glow that you can have, which is just, a prolonged level of simplification and attentiveness. And I think it pays back. And there was that kind of change, which was big. And then there was just a very, very different view of the country that I have. One thing I love to point out to people, and this is maybe getting a little out there, but most of you probably know that, the kind of difference between the two versions of Greek concepts of time, the sort of chronos time, that is just chronological watch time, and the sort of imbued with meaning, sort of explosively radiant sort of time that is the time you remember maybe on your deathbed or whatever. And that, like the 26 days of my walk are basically the exact version of that form of time. And I since then have driven hundreds and hundreds of miles, hundreds of hours of miles up and down the I-95 for book events since my book came out. And the remnant from those drives is zero. I have not one memory of one moment in that car, maybe a memory of a podcast or something I'm listening to. But if a seagull had hit my windshield, I would remember that. It didn't happen. So, and my main word to myself is we all have the choice to either allot our time in that kind of, kairos, kind of like meaningful, imbued with light time, or we have the chronos blurred, life whizzes by time. And for the most part, it's hard to get the balance even to the, 90-10 versus the 80-20 or the 50-50. But when you do a walk like this, I think it really drives home how our real kind of chief obligation on our time on Earth is to try to magnify that illuminated time.
Great, thank you. We have a question. We have a couple questions in the chat, and I don't know if the people who wrote them would like to say their question. Alexandra, do you want to speak it, or do you want me to read it?
We could answer Alexandra's question, which I think is a really interesting one. And I had that question asked of me a bunch of times after the walk, which was not just the gender question, but of course there's also the race question. And there's that whole question of who is it that's walking and how are they received? And I write about that also in the book. I mean, I am who I am. I come off as I come off. I'm a journalist. I know how to interact with people. I'm not afraid of walking onto people's yards. And I think it's a very valid thing to ask. And, but on the other hand, I definitely push back against the people that make the immediate assumption that a woman couldn't do this walk, or a Black man couldn't do this walk, or whatever one wants to argue. And, there are all the books that are out there of all the women that have done the Pacific Crest Trail, the Appalachian Trail, or done any number of different things. There's a pretty well-known National Geographic Black writer who walked across the United States without even talking to people. He had given himself a vow of silence. This was, I think, in the 70s. I met a guy who stood up at a book event and asked me could a Black man have done your walk? And he was himself a Black man. And I made the argument. I said, yeah, I think he could. It really all depends on on who the person is and if they feel at home in that setting, are they natural in wanting to do it? And when I talked to him afterwards, he's this guy that I'd already communicated with who had done like a walk all the way from Maryland to the Canadian border and had done all these walks through the South, and he was himself a veteran walker. He just wanted to hear what
Oh.
my that was. And when I told him, he said, I completely agree with what you said. I mean, on the other hand, he's been hassled in ways that I haven't been hassled.
Yeah.
The experience is different, but I kind of push back against the idea of who can and can't do a walk like this, because I think it's sort of self-limiting.
What about you, Tom? Do you have an opinion of that? The question is, how much of your safety and welcome do you think had to do with your gender?
Yeah, I would back up certainly with my own opinion, albeit not obviously lived experience. I think his walk would have been marginally more dangerous for a woman or a person of color than mine, simply because you're just not seeing any, sort of human monsters out in the wilderness that would really want to, or be able to do you any harm. The challenges there are different. I mean, at least the Arizona Trail is an incredibly it's a place full of solitude. I saw only 4 in the course of 46 days, with the exception of the portion through the Grand Canyon, which is heavily trafficked. I saw only 4 other hikers, through
Wow.
hikers, doing what I was doing. Right. There was one point where I hitchhiked into a town and then back out again. Hitchhiking is a separate category, and I think there probably is some, whatever you want to call it, privilege, safety that comes from identity in those situations. So I both agree with those who would ask that question. I think it is an absolutely valid question, but I think Neil's response is spot on. That it within the limits of luck, depending on making sure not to run into the right jerk. It absolutely can be done safely. And I don't think anyone should feel like this experience is prohibited to them.
Any other-
Andrew has a question. Do you want to voice it, Andrew, or do you want me to read it? Okay. Where and when will you walk and write about next?
Actually, we were talking about this the other day, and that I just kind of
Yeah.
came up my idea for my next book, which is going to actually have to be a car travel thing, because I it's going to be very far flung, but it's going to be about kind of the transformative power of trauma, I guess, for people who experience, the right people I need to go find who have had shocks to their system, health-wise or whatever, who have found kind of a new sense of purpose and meaning in life as a result. And it kind of goes with some of interesting, really amazingly interesting revelatory experiences that I've had myself, even this month. So that is, but I'm, on the other hand, I just mentioned this guy who asked me that question, and I want to reach out to Ken, because I really
I thought that was Ken. I thought when you mentioned him, I thought, oh, Ken Johnston. I'm sorry he's not here.
Yeah, and that was at the Philadelphia Free Library when I did an event. And I want to propose to him that we do a walk maybe together, or he come from one direction, I come from the other, we meet and then walk back the other way, but to walk from Washington, D.C., the U.S. capital, to essentially the capital of the Confederacy in Richmond. And I think that would be like a really, I mean, it's not that long. It would take 12 days or so to do it right. It's like, really richly interesting. And I would love to do it with him, to kind of have the chance to talk about the things you would talk about on a walk between those two spaces. So I'm a big fan of those kinds of walks that have like their own kind of imbued meaning. And, like Gettysburg or to Harper's Ferry or things like that. So I have a variety of things that I've planned, and I'm pondering. It's all, as we know, about breaking away and actually, doing it, right? Like, it's one thing to ponder and plan. It's the other thing to break away and do it.
Oh, that's exciting to hear. Ken Johnston, if I don't know how many of you know of him or his work. He is an African-American walking artist. He lives here lives in Philadelphia, where I live, and he's been doing he did a series of walks. He first followed a civil rights trail, and now he was following the route of Harriet Tubman up into Canada. And he didn't do it all in a single walk, and he's also been raising money to support it, and he'll walk with other people. That's a fabulous idea.
Yeah, I want to run. I'd love to.
Yeah, he's a great guy. Tom, what about you?
Sorry, muted. When I did the Arizona Trail, I didn't have 2 little kids, and now I do. So this is that's I'm gonna have to live on memories of that for quite a while.
Yeah, I think then the answer is I'm going to walk to the park. That is, I did an event recently for Ways of Walking, and I had a really good question, which was, what's the most radical walk you've ever taken? Which was an interesting question. And one of the writers who was with me said that the most radical walk he took was when he walked to at a corporate meeting to Vanguard, where they were protesting Vanguard's investment policies in fossil fuels, and the walk up to the microphone. So I think you could think of walks in more creative ways, especially when you have small children or have other things to do.
Yes, and for anyone who wants to pick it up, that's an anthology right there. The most dangerous walks I've ever taken. Which danger is maybe defined differently here. Emotional danger. The walk I took away from an abusive marriage. The walk walking out of the office of a crappy job. I'm suddenly intrigued with that idea.
Okay, good. Does anybody else have a question or a comment?
Long question.
Do you want to read? Do you want to voice it, or do you want me to read it, Frank?
Well, I'll voice it. That's really long. So I knew a guy back in 1990s, and he was an old timer, and he had some grown children. But back when they were younger, he sent them off to Iran, is what I heard, just for a vacation. I don't know, 1 week. Maybe it was a month. And the idea was to show them, your way is not the only way. And, I think any kind of walk through the US also exposes you to just other people's ways. And Neil and Tom, you were talking about the politics, of different states and how people are stuck in their own ways, but if you can get out and experience the way other people live, I think it really broadens your horizons, and just how you value other people, how you value your own town. And so, yeah, I was just kind of throwing that out there. What you thought of that, if that makes sense. It doesn't have to be Iran. It can be anywhere. It can be Topeka, Kansas.
Sure. Thank you, Frank. And if I take your question correctly, the value of just simply perambulating in a foreign environment. I try to live by a suggestion of the novelist James Michener. Many of you will recall him. Neil, he wrote one of the best books about your home state of Colorado that I have ever read, Centennial, right? He advised people, when you're in a foreign country, go to the central train station and then take a spoke train, a spoke on the map out to a village that's not touristed, that you've not heard of, disembark and get around and just simply walk in this completely random stop, whether it be out in the boonies, whether it be in the middle of a little village or a suburb. And it may be incredibly bland. There may not be anything scenic there, but in so doing, if you do this, you're going to learn a lot, far more about that country than you would just sort of hitting the cathedrals and the arches and the various tourist spots.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
I become, since my book came out, friends with this writer, Rinker Buck, who's done some great books. He did a book recently that was called Life on the Mississippi, where he built a flat bottom boat and went down the Mississippi and the Ohio River. And that book really drove home a very basic point. And it's kind of the counterpoint to what was the tragic but otherwise absurd, death of the guys who paid $500,000 to die on their way to the Titanic. Like, the whole concept of like going to the bottom of the Atlantic to see a wrecked ship, through a tiny porthole so you can go to a cocktail party and tell people that you did it, versus the actual like foreign magic of the places that are actually within 20 miles of your house if you approach them the right way. And the stuff that Rinker writes about and saw and experienced on the Mississippi River and the Ohio River are like magical pockets of the country that all the people flying to exotic, places overseas are missing out on entirely. And my walk, when I went through Lancaster County and had these extraordinary encounters with the Amish and the Mennonites and this ongoing experiment of people who came here, basically in the late 1600s, early 1700s to, well, I guess maybe late 1700s, to carve out a life that they are still pursuing, that has basically altered like not at all since that time. That's extraordinary stuff, but we generally don't give it the due it deserves. And it's a matter of kind of Instagram influence, where people want to have certain images more than certain experiences. But it's kind of a blindsidedness that I think a lot of people suffer from.
Yeah, I think that I'm gonna jump in too, because Frank, I think that certainly the experience of going overseas, and one of the issues of America is that we're so locked into it's such an island, and we think that we're the center of the world. And so to go to another country and experience another country and live in another country is a way to shake that perspective. But at the same time, I think that you can have those kinds of experiences by walking in your own hometown. I mean, that's you can find places. That's what I found by walking the perimeter, just deciding to walk the edge of the city. I feel connected to the city and to places that I never would have gone, and never, I was very much, the downtown, the center city, that is the city. And it just, all of a sudden you see these places that people live in, they're like these Russian neighborhoods, or they're these little subcultures of people who have boats and fish because they live on the river, and that's all part of the same city. So there's this way that you're connected, but you're also have your sense of place expanded and your sense of connection expanded. So I think it's available, as Neil was saying. You can go 20 miles, you could sometimes go 5 miles and see something different. And there's something about the connection, the fact walking, and we didn't really get into that a little bit with what Neil was saying, but that connectiveness, that every place is connected to another. In your books, both of your books talk about crossing various borders that were significant borders. Neil comes up to the Mason-Dixon line, and he has this very moving section where he's sort of imagining what it would have been like to be, a runaway slave, and trying to, what did that line mean when now it doesn't seem like anything. And Tom's book ends at the Mexican border, and then has this kind of coda of crossing into Mexico and following the paths of migrants. And I just was thinking about what, when you walk, does it erase borders? Does it erase this sense of what a border is and how artificial or arbitrary they are?
They are certainly that. And Tom lives near one of the most fraught borders of all, and we'll see how long it becomes either more hardened or more imaginary, for that matter. But I think we're entering a time in history where the whole concept of borders are alone going to be the most explosive social force that we're facing in Europe, and particularly that's going to be the case. And do you let these people in? Because they are growing exponentially faster in some continents than in others. And that, you know, it's going to become so untheoretical. It's going to be, you know, and we're seeing it happen. We're seeing the politics of places change as a result of that kind of pressure. But the one little, I know we're kind of nearing the end of these. One of these sort of things I would love to urge people to do is to really think about a walk, not so much just around their city, but a walk that is out their own door, which we all have, off to some place, even if it be only 2 or 3 days, but where you really immerse yourself in the why are you doing that? What is the pilgrimage destination you're going to? And I found such value in the out my front door aspect of the walk. And I know most people tend to, you know, take a plane or a car or whatever to a trailhead or something similar to it. But I really do believe that the ultimate trailhead is the front door of your house, and that where it can lead to, if you do it with a certain degree of intentionality over a span of time, is intrinsically different than the more kind of destination oriented airport highway walk, you know, access kind of things. It's just a different thing.
Thanks. We do have another question. First of all, Jonathan, do you want to talk about your comment, or is that a comment and not a question? Or you can.
Just a comment. I just thank you all. This is so good. And Neil, I do want to say really quick, I share the exact same thing with so many students and young people around. If I could share anything right out the front door, just go for a couple hours, for a couple days. So just honoring that. Thank you. Yeah, just a comment.
Thank you. And we also have a question from Tamsin, who said, who has a beautiful talks about, she's now walking around a small Catalonian village, making a sound walk. But she's interested in this idea that when you meet people, every individual has a story as interesting as everyone else's. Every place has fascination. So how did you resist telling all the details about each place you visited and hold the whole in your mind as you went?
Yeah, I saw that question. You know, Tom and I are both journalists, which helps a lot, because one of the things you learn as a journalist is what to leave out, and that degree of discernment. And you know, so it's a difficult thing, but it's like super essential to keep things spare, especially if you're trying to tell a story, and otherwise you just lose interest. I mean, one of my favorite walking books of all time is the, you know, very elusive and strange In Patagonia, Bruce Chapman book. And, you know, that book is mysterious throughout. And of course, there are certain aspects of it that I think he essentially, you know, contrived on his own. But, you know, he leaves out all kinds of things. And but what he puts in has just this extreme degree of potency. And it makes it this kind of, you know, magical expedition off to find, you know, some mastodon hide in a cave or whatever. But so the leaving out part is a good part of the magic of telling any good story.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, it's hard, but it's true. Tom, what do you have to say to that?
Yeah, just very quickly, I think it's a great question that Tamsin asks. Narratives are big A and small A. They're always about something on a literal level. In this case, it's going to be a walk, but they're always also good nonfiction is a big A, a big about. What is the larger sense of what you're trying to do? In Neil's case, his book was about rediscovering America, about rediscovering some truths, developing a deeper relationship with my home state and reconciling a certain argument I had with it. And every encounter that you have, yeah, you could easily do this sort of diaristic. I went here today and I talked to this person and I talked to this person, and it seems very disconnected. But what you're looking for as a writer when you're and not just a diary or a journal, is to look for that larger aboutness. You know, does that encounter, if you write it, serve the larger aboutness, the big A? And if it does, then yeah, you're going to find a way to smoothly work it into the narrative in a way that doesn't jar the reader by, now, wait a minute, we're talking to a German woman and, oh, hold on, here's someone else with 3 kids. And, you know, what does this all mean? You know, the systematizing of it is essential.
I like that. The big A. That's not the big A in Anaheim.
Which I see up the freeway every time I go to
Yeah,
work.
I know. I said that for your benefit.
Thank you.
Thank you both. This was really wonderful. I think we could keep talking. I'm sorry we can't adjourn somewhere and have a beer together, but we'll have to do that some other time on some other walk. But thank you all who came and participated. And here's Andrew inviting us to the next talk on the next. Is this your next salon, Andrew? I'm talking about walking along the North Sea coast in Scotland. This is our inaugural event. We're going to have aim to do it quarterly. Jonathan, who's here, and I'm really happy to see his face and hear his voice, is going to be a guest, upcoming guest, I think in the spring. So we're going to work that out. And just if you have writers to recommend, know people who we're a big country. There are lots of writers and there are lots of walkers. So I'm open to hearing about what people are doing and thinking about people who might have interesting things to say to each other in a conversation. But Tom and Neil, thank you so much for joining us and being part of this. And next time. And thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Babak. Thank you, Walk, Listen, Create. And thank you all audience. Bye-bye.